The summer I was 9, my father came home with a pig in the back of the truck. The pig was big, with thick bristles along his spine, and he scratched his back against the barbed wire. "We're going to fatten him up," my father said. He threw food into a long trough, and then he stood back and crossed his thick arms. I followed Jackson to the pen, but I wouldn't touch the pig. Jackson was 14 and braver than me. He let the pig eat from his bare hand, but I held tight to a long stick. That night I put a piece of bacon on the windowsill to warn the pig to stay away. My mother had a broken arm that summer. Each day while my father went to work, she got up and cleaned the house, and I helped her until my hands were raw from Ajax. When I heard my father's car pull into the drive, I would run to Jackson. We would wait to hear our father's voice, to know if he was angry. Sometimes if they fought, my mother would come to my room at night, sit on the edge of my bed and whisper, "You must be brave, Lydia," she would say. "You must trust me." All summer long, the pig kept rooting under the fence and my father kept rebuilding it. I thought it must mean something that the pig kept escaping, that maybe it hated my father, that maybe it had powers. I tried to have powers too. If I counted my steps in 3s, I promised myself, if I saw 2 birds on the roof of the house, if the rain came by 4, then my father would be kinder. My father would be new. In June, while my father was at work, we put clothes into bags and put them in the car. The pig watched us as we drove away. My mother took us to a hotel, but my father followed us and brought us back. He made dinner and danced my mother around the living room, but I felt afraid to let them be alone. I sat up late into the night with Jackson, listening, waiting, held tight to his hand, and he didn't let go. The next day, I took one of my father's beer bottles into the shed and smashed it to pieces until it was half dust. There was a dark, empty hole in the wall behind my bed, down by the floor where I kept secret things. I kept the bottle back there, at least what had been the bottle, wrapped up in an old rag. "You must be patient," my mother told me. "You must believe in me." I was patient, and I did, but every night when I was in bed, I reached down to the floor, into the dark space, and felt for that rag. There was quiet for the rest of June. It got to the point where I stopped reaching for the rag in the dark. I let the pig eat a slice of apple from my hand and wasn't scared at all. On the 4th of July, we went to Marysville to watch the fireworks. My mother looked so beautiful, and the fireworks were bright blooms in the sky above the water tower. What happened between that hour and the next? My father drove the truck home over the rutted road too fast, and when he pulled up to the house, he pushed my mother out into the dirt. Jackson took my hand and we jumped out of the truck, ran to the edge of the pasture and crouched down. The pig came to us and pushed his head through the fence, and we all waited in the dark until it was over. I touched the pig's nose. "Shh," I said, and the pig stayed quiet. The air was quiet and mean after that. The longer it lasted, the farther my brother and I ventured into the woods, across the property lines that were deep in fireweed and salal. At the end of July, when the brush was thick and dark, we followed the creek until it ended at a pile of trash. We opened one of the trash bags and things came spilling out. Eggshells, torn paper, orange peels. Jackson held up a broken wicker basket. It had plastic eyes and was made to look like an owl. We brought it home and I kept it hidden under my bed. I thought we might be caught, and so later I walked to the edge of the woods and threw it as far as I could. We played with the pig every time our parents fought now. His bristled back scratched my palms. I fed him scraps from the table and wanted to be good, to do right. If I could only be good enough, I thought surely it would count for something. Surely things would change. At night, I lay awake and listened to my parents talking. Not the words, just the sounds. "I love you, I hate you, I'm sorry." Jackson was in his room all the time, listening to music on his headphones and drawing in his notebook. Now that he was 14, he kept his door shut all the time and wouldn't let me hear his music, but still he let me come in and sit by him. I stared into the snowy tunnels of the blankets. On weekends, he'd take me with him to Randy's house, and while he and Randy smoked pot, I would hold the lizard, let it crawl up my arms and around my shoulders. In August, the pig escaped again, and my father called the butcher. I was sad, but didn't say it. I stared at the square white packages, lined up like coffins in the freezer. I held one in my hand until it burned with cold. I tried not to look at the empty place in the pasture where the pig had been. When my father broke my mother's nose, I made a sandwich out of the bacon I would never eat myself. My hands were shaking to touch that bacon. I carried the sandwich to my room and brought the rag out of the dark space behind the bed. I poured the glass dust into my hand and looked at it shining, and then I laid it between the mayonnaise and the meat. The perfect sandwich, the worst thing I'd ever done. I stood in my bedroom and looked at the sandwich. I tried to pick up the plate to carry it to my father. I counted to 10 and then I counted to 10 again. The plate was heavy as the moon. I couldn't move. Now, I thought, do it now. When I heard my father's boots in the hall, I couldn't breathe. He was coming toward me and all I had to do was hold it up. It was a gift for him to take, but I ruined it all. I ran past him with the plate in my hands, out the back door and into the woods behind the house, where I buried the sandwich in the dirt by the creek. I threw the plate into the underbrush and no one ever knew. Now I think that if I had told Jackson, it would have been different. He would have helped me be brave. He would have understood how badly I wanted my father to disappear, and what happened later might not have happened at all. But I thought Jackson already knew. He was the one beside me in the grass outside, trying to keep me from hearing them. The pig was nowhere, but still he held me there in the grass, scratching the dirt, saying low, low, listen, you can hear the hooves, listen. Out by the old metal storage locker and the torn up garden plot, and the water soaked the knees of her jeans. She could see the house through the dark winter brush, hear the hard crack of the axe and the sound of the rain dripping from the trees, a soft and intermittent staccato. The storm last night had taken down a tree on the slick, steep drive. The old winch had jammed months ago and they hadn't replaced it, so Gary had gone to town and rented one to drag the tree up to the house, where he was splitting and stacking it for firewood. He would have to return the winch by 8. She moved quickly, opening the storage locker, pushing aside the rusted trowels, feeling through the loose seed packets until she found the one she wanted. She slipped the cucumber packet deep into her pocket and started toward the house. Her ribs hurt and she held her arms tight at her sides. The wind was whipping her face, cold and wet, and she could smell chimney smoke. January. It had been 19 years since she'd left Texas with Gary and moved out to Washington. 19 years that she'd lived with him and raised their 2 children. She ran her fingertips over the envelope in her pocket, emptied of seeds and packed tight with the money she'd stolen from her husband. Inside the house, she opened soup cans for dinner, stirred their contents together in a saucepan on the stove. She'd put plastic over the window after he pushed her through the glass, and she could hear the rain tapping against it. The sound of it made her sick to her stomach, thinking of how her children had watched him push her. 6 o'clock, half an hour for dinner, she thought, and then Gary would return the winch. She called down the hall for Jackson and Lydia to set the table, which they did, quietly, Jackson passing the plates to his little sister. After the 4 of them had eaten, still quietly, and after Gary had pulled away in the truck, she turned to Jackson. "Get the things you and your sister need," she said, "now." She handed them 2 garbage bags and took one to her bedroom. She pulled things out of drawers without really looking at them, and they put all of the bags in the back seat of the car, the shitty, unreliable one. She said a quick prayer to no one that it wouldn't break down before they made it to town. They were all silent as she drove. Lydia ducked down in the back seat, Jackson looking out the window. She took the back road around Marine View Drive. Gary would be on the other end of town collecting his deposit. Everett wasn't far away enough, she thought. But that was the point. He would think they'd try to get farther away, so they'd stay close. She drove the car up and down the dusky streets, not looking at where she was going, until she found a motel that looked abandoned. The parking lot was walled off from the street. A burnt-out sign read, "The Starlight." Jackson and Lydia brought in their backpacks and the garbage bags of hastily packed clothes. She watched them, holding her arms against her broken ribs. Here were her children. Jackson, at 18, looked delicate and beautiful and older than the other boys his age, the ones she sometimes saw milling around the high school parking lot. Lydia was small for 13. Her children blinking dark and light in turns, striated with the things they let her know, what she inferred, what they kept from her. Never again, she thought, will they see Gary put his hands on me. Never again will they worry their days, stringing minutes into hours, listening for footsteps and raised voices. They locked the motel door and pulled the curtains. Jackson turned on the television and they sat in its blue light. A news report she didn't hear, a sitcom, noise. She would talk to Jackson and Lydia more in the morning, but for now, they would rest. They'd done this all before anyway, the television drone, the dim light, the uncertainty. When they had climbed into the flat, rough bed, she let herself imagine it, allowed herself a faint, warm hope that she would never see her husband again, that he would not find them and they would be free. 19 years ago, she thought, and still she remembered it like it was yesterday. She and Gary had barely pulled off the interstate and bought a newspaper when they found the ad, a plot of land going cheap. They drove there the same day. It was on the edge of the Tulalip Reservation, 5 acres that needed a well, needed to be bulldozed again. It's a good half hour from the nearest town. They pulled up in their pickup after driving from Texas where they'd both grown up. The back seat was full of suitcases. The 9th of January, 1991. It was a cold Wednesday, bone chill and damp, a dark little new year. Even now she could remember the day because of the way it felt like a beginning, like her whole life was about to start. Even in the dead of winter, the brush was thick and green over the little plowed road. The owner had led them around, picking over the fallen blackberry, copses of alder, round stands of fern, and Amy had taken in the dark loam, the overgrown ghosts of the dozed paths, the flat area at the top of the hill where the house should go. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to feel, so different from anything she'd known, but it would be there, she thought. Surely it would not take long for it to begin to feel like her own. When they'd seen the whole of the property, walked from corner to corner, sighted and nodded at the orange flag and tape, Gary had said, "We'd like it, sir," and the owner had smiled, and they knew he would sell it to them. It'd be more than 5 years before Gary hit her for the first time, and 10 before her love for him dissolved into a sharp beat of fear in her side, her stomach, her heart. They'd stood together under a maple beneath the dripping pavilion of its leaves. And now, in the dim room of the starlight, Amy thought of all the things her 18-year-old self had left behind all those years ago. Her kind, worried mother, her father, who'd come back from Vietnam when she was only an infant, but never really come back at all, her best friend Jennifer, and her old dog Sam. The streets of Fannin, Texas, the brisket smell, the bad bars, and tire iron windows of the shops on the outskirts of town. Now, in the starlight, her children were sleeping, and she tried to sleep herself, tried to dream her dreams into them, to dream a new life again, to will it to be coming for them even now. Dawn drove the 2 hours from Silver to Missoula while Jackson slept. They had worked all week. It was Friday afternoon, and even though it was still early, Jackson's whole body ached. 100 miles or so through dirty snow, occasional breathtaking scarps of rock and pine. The little towns like Silver, old mining towns set off I-90, dirty bars that he wished they could stop at. A bar for anyone, Jackson thought, except for 2 men who were together. The trip had been Don's idea. For the 4th of July, he said, "I want to show you Missoula. We'll get a hotel, go out on the river, say yes." Later, Jackson would think of 100 questions, starting with what it all meant, but he said nothing. He felt still inside. He said yes. Don pulled off at one of the first exits before the town had even shown itself. A truck stop exit. There was a bar, a spaceship of a convenience store, a strip club, and a motel, which Don pulled into. Jackson had imagined that Don would want a fancier place, at least a Holiday Inn, someplace mildly astringent, and he felt briefly pleased and then disappointed. This was on Don's dime. Some shameful part of himself had wanted vicarious luxury. Instead, they had a dirty little room that smelled of smoke. It was, in fact, the dirtiest motel he'd ever seen. Worse than the starlight. There were cigarette burns on the plasticized spread, and the walls were stained with hazy continents. Don took the backpack from Jackson's hands and tossed it on the single chair and pushed Jackson down on the bed. His arms were tight around Jackson, and Jackson could hear Don's heart pounding, feel it against him. The beat drove a quick, delicious pain into Jackson's heart. Don's wedding ring was a narrow belt cutting into his fourth finger, worn so long that there was no way to slip it off. In the morning, Don drove him slowly through town. Jackson was watching him to see if he was nervous. What if they ran into someone new? He wanted it to happen, just to know what Don would say, but the truck passed unnoticed through the streets while Don pointed to the bridges, the way to the college, the Wilma Theater, the Clark Fork River running high through the center of town. Don came through here all the time, Jackson knew. Don had told him this much. He would leave Silver late at night, then arrive in mid-morning the next day with supplies. Jackson couldn't bring himself to ask, but he knew what that meant. A few hours stolen with his wife in the middle of the night. Now, beside Don in the truck, Jackson allowed himself the fact that he'd hoped that this trip meant something, that Don was acknowledging their thing, that Don's wife didn't mean much to Don anymore. Jackson allowed himself the fact that he'd hoped for proof of it. At some kind of moment in town, some interaction with Don's real life would prove that Jackson himself might be a part of it, now or one day. They drove east, and just out of town, Don pulled off at an old dance hall. He went in and bought some whiskey, and they parked near the river. Don pulled his fly rod and tackle box out of the back of the truck. Montana was beautiful, somehow more majestic than Idaho. The cottonwoods flicked their arms over the dark green of the river. Jackson had never gone anywhere with someone he'd dated. It gave him a little thrill, my boyfriend. Don looked even easier and more coltish by the river, his palms on his knees. Here they were in this place that was Don's, the Clark Fork winding path, slow and green, houses on stilts, the tumble of gravel into the river. He imagined them doing manly Montana things together. More fishing, Don with a line of silver trout, Jackson on a horse picking his way up into the hills. He liked this kind of tableau, even if he'd never held a fishing pole in his life. The only time he'd ridden a horse had been in the sawdust arena at the Puyallup Fair. Jackson took off his shirt and lay back on the warm rocks, watching Don sort through his tackle. "Let me show you a cast," Don said, but Jackson shook his head. "You go on," he called. The sun was on him. He wanted to stay there forever. Don picked up the bottle and opened it and took a drink. He looked at Jackson. "You make me feel old," Don said. "You make me feel like an old man." They spent most of the day at the river, then ate at a gas station cafe. When it grew dark, Don drove them up above town. They hiked up the brown scrub until Don stopped and they nested down in the dirt. He had his face buried in Don's jacket when the fireworks started. The buttons against his cheek, the warm smell of sweat and struck matches. "Hey," Don said, and touched his hair. He slipped his fingers under Jackson's chin and tilted his face toward the sky. "Hey, Jack, you're missing it." The hill was a silvery stage for the half-hearted displays down in town, dusty Roman candles and the smell of sulfur. Don lifted Jackson's cheek from his jacket and toward the sky, the colored sparks and smoke. "You and me," Don said. They had a bottle of cheap wine that Don tipped up to his mouth. A shower of sparks lit his face in carnival pinks and blues. Don handed the bottle to Jackson. "A sweet little boy and a bottle of wine," Don said. "That's what it takes to make a honky-tonk time." "Is that what it takes?" Jackson pushed his face against Don's neck. "George Strait," said Don, "one of the greats." It wasn't George Strait, it was Dwight Yoakam, originally Johnny Horton, but Jackson let it go. Don's neck smelled like aftershave and cigarettes, the worst fireworks display Jackson had seen in his life. 3 or 4 wilting rockets gave off an uneven spray of sparks. He remembered watching the fireworks in Everett last year, sitting down by the water with Randy and a stolen 5th of gin. That all seemed very far away now. Don kissed the palm of his hand and held his lips there. Jackson watched the smoke fall, drifting down like streamers from a party. It was beautiful, he thought. All of it was beautiful because here they were together. That old trick, love makes the world new, trite conceits, sugary lies, and still. Always he had thought of his life as if it were waiting somewhere else, a party he might finally arrive at, late, breathless, taking off his coat. It nagged at him that maybe no one was waiting anywhere at all. But now, Don pushed Jackson's hand up under his shirt and held it there against the broad plane of Don's chest. Down the hill, Jackson could see shadowy figures and sparklers dripping brief, bright rain. When the last stray fireworks had faded to smoke hanging over the valley, they made their way back to the truck, walking gingerly in the dark. Don drove them back to the motel. Jackson was asleep, deep asleep, and when he woke up, it took him a long time to remember where he was. The springs of the bed creaking, the dark like a heavy fabric over him, the cheap, slick feeling of the motel blanket. Don was moving around in the room. Jackson reached for the light. Don was dressed, pulling on his coat. "What are you doing?" Jackson asked. The coarse sheets and the smell of cigarettes were all around him. Don walked over to him, switched the light back off. "You're tired," he said. "Listen, you just get some sleep, okay? I'll be back." He was out the door before Jackson realized exactly what had happened, or maybe he was too surprised to say anything. He lay in the dark, not sleeping, a sick feeling coming over him about what he suspected Don was doing, and how, in the moment when Don walked out the door, Jackson had let him go. Like a dirty call boy, he thought, like a nobody, and now Don was probably unlocking the door to his house, to his wife. What other explanation was there? And Jackson had let him go without saying a word. It felt familiar. All his life he thought he'd wanted the people around him to feel good. He'd not wanted to start a fight. And where had that gotten him? The not speaking, the not fighting. He thought of his father, still drunk mornings when he would roar around the house, sheets sweated through, Lydia on his shoulders, shrieking and giggling, happiness and fear. The first time he'd seen his father beat his father had come home late. Carpenters were being laid off. They were coming for him, he said. In 2 weeks his job would end, and who knew how long it would take until he found a new project. He had a drink in his hand by the time he crossed the kitchen from the back door, and by 8 he was reading the same page of the newspaper again and again, talking to himself. He said something to Jackson's mother that Jackson didn't hear, and she was crying, covering her face with both hands. A murky little memory, just his father trying to lift her up from her chair, but she would not stand. "This is my home," he cried suddenly. "You are my wife. This is my son." He looked at Jackson while he shook her. "Stand up," he cried. "You are my wife. This is my chair." Because he was 7, because he knew the power of possessions, it did not occur to him to wonder what it all meant. He was scared only, and he understood that his father's ownership over them, over even grief itself, was absolute. His mother did not stand. He lifted his hand and struck her across the face. Her lips split and she stopped crying, but she did not say a word. She would not look at him. In the back of the house, Lydia started to cry. His father put down his hands. He pressed his face to Amy's breastbone for a long time, and then he stood and led Jackson to the truck, and together they went out to town. And so, Jackson thought, he had been complicit his whole life. He couldn't explain why, but he had the same feeling now. He drifted through a light and restless sleep, sick to his stomach, the clock blinking through 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4. He was half angry and half hating himself. His heart darted around in his chest. When he finally heard steps outside the door, the fumble of the key card in the door, he kept his eyes closed and his face turned into the pillow. Jackson heard Don come into the room, but he didn't say anything. It was 4:30, 5. The light was just this side of dark. "Jack," Don whispered. "Jack."